Welcome to this afternoon's NAESP Webinar Wednesday, Bold Action for Challenging Times, Intensify Your Leadership. At this time, I would like to introduce NAESP's Associate Executive Director of Professional Learning, Dr. Gracie Branch.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. I know that you're in for a real treat. I've known Dr. Michael Cherichello for a long time, and he never disappoints. He's one of the most reflective practitioners that I know, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cherichello, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Gracie, and thank you all for coming this afternoon to this webinar. Let me just begin by telling you that my life began at 50, not the age of 50, but the school. I was an elementary school teacher in the Southeast Bronx in New York City. And from my teaching career of, I guess, about 30 years, as teacher, as assistant principal, and principal, and county superintendent of schools, I then began my work at the, after spending 30 years in the public schools, I spent about 17 years in higher education as a professor and department chair, both in New Jersey and in Kentucky. All during that time and continuing to this time, I am a consultant who has presented nationally and internationally. And in my spare time, I like to ride my bike. So I'm a cyclist, and I've cycled in many different countries in Europe, as well as states in the United States. And last but not least, the 50 roses stand for the 50 years that I have been married to my wife, who was a first grade teacher for many years. And we celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary last summer. I met her at Public School 50, where I was a substitute for a week in her class. And she came back and told me that the students in her class actually, right in my nose, took things from her desk, and I didn't know it. So she said, you know, you're not such a great teacher after all. You didn't know what was going on right in front of you. And she became my mentor and eventually my wife. And so that's a little bit about me. These are tough times. COVID-19 has kind of invaded our lives in many different ways. And it's made lives of principals in schools very complex. And I thank you for taking time, despite all of the complexities of your life, to give us about an hour of your time this afternoon to share some insights and ideas. And as we begin to do that, I'd like you to reflect for a moment on this saying from Kofi Annan: to live is to choose, but to choose well, you must know who you are choosing and what you stand for, where you want to go, and why you want to get there. And so as we think of our time together this afternoon, I'd like you to kind of try and unplug from the stress and the challenges that you face day after day as principals, assistant principals, in whatever role you play in the schools, and to try and give yourself this opportunity to spend some time with each other. I must tell you, this is my first webinar that I've done. I find webinars too much of talking. And so I have attempted this afternoon to involve you in the webinar, because I believe we learn from each other. You just don't learn from me, and I don't learn from you, but we learn from each other. So this is going to be a bit engaging as we go through this afternoon, more so than perhaps you have seen in other webinars. And I'm hoping at the end, you will walk away with some takeaways that will be valuable to you as you go forward in your life as principals and assistant principals in your schools. I'd like to focus on 4 big ideas with you: that of a dreamer, an architect, a change mediator, and an innovator. And I would propose to you that you are all in each of those things in your roles as principals. We know that in our volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world today, we are going to take a look of your role as dreamer, as architect, as change mediator, and as innovator. And I'd like you to kind of reflect with me through these things, because we are used to looking at ourselves only as education, as instructional leaders. And I'd like to broaden that this afternoon with you. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, what are you hoping to gain from this webinar? If you can enter some ideas, some thoughts in the chat box for a minute, and we'll read a few of them, and I'll react to what you put out there. So take a moment and write something in the chat box. What are you hoping to gain from this webinar this afternoon?
We're hearing ideas for ways to lead my team during these times.
Yes, we're going to focus in on the role of the principal as architect in building teams and share some insights on team building. So yes, we're going to do that.
Also, strategies to improve leadership during COVID. How to focus on self-care as an administrator.
Okay. Well, as we go forward this afternoon, there will be several more times where I will ask you to kind of reflect in the chat box, and Danielle will read some of them to me, and I will react to them as we go through this. So we try and make this a bit more interactive than just sitting back and listening to my talking head here. We want to do more than that as we work together. For many years now, the emphasis on principals has been on instructional leaders. Principals are instructional leaders. And although principals are instructional leaders, Michael Fullan, in his work on The Principal, a fantastic book, which I hope you would have the opportunity to read. It's called The Principal by Michael Fullan. He says that to focus on your role as instructional leaders is too narrow a focus. And he suggests that there's a much wider focus. And part of that is to be an instructional leader, but to broaden it more to becoming an education leader, more so, and looking at many different hats that you wear in terms of becoming an education leader. It's kind of like looking at this picture. If you take a look at this picture for a minute, only 1% of the population is able to find the animal in the image in less than 2 minutes. Take a look and see if you see the animal. I'm not going to give you a full 2 minutes, but I'll give you a few seconds to take a look and see if you can see in this picture an animal. Obviously, there's a man's face. In order to see the animal, we have to turn the picture upside down. And there is a dog eating a bone, and it's right there. And the idea is that I'd like you this afternoon to kind of take a look at your role as principals in a different way, in a different perception. And as we go through this afternoon, see how much of this resonates with you in terms of what you do and what your role is as principal. Because in our world today, you wear many hats. And today we are looking at 4 of those hats: the dreamer, the architect, the innovator, and the change mediator. There are many other education roles that you have: the designer, the appraiser, the coach. And in the center of all this, COVID-19 has entered into your lives in terms of causing just very complex and ambiguous situations that none of us has ever experienced before. And so this is a new way of looking at your role as principal. A lot of times we hear that the principal is the instructional leader. What I would propose to you, and what Michael Fullan says, is that you're far beyond that. You're the education leader. You're the leading learner in your school. And as such, you are a dreamer. You are an architect, a designer, an appraiser, a coach, a mediator, and an innovator. And as you take a look at this today, we want to take a look at looking at your leadership capacity by taking a look at your role as dreamer and architect, and leading with competence and confidence in your role as a change mediator and as an innovator. And I think if we take a look at this today, we'll give you an opportunity to intensify your leadership, to develop it from wherever it may be, to kick it up a notch, and to take a look and say, how can I do these things more effectively despite all of the challenges that I face in today's schools? And so as we look at these today, we're going to take a look first at the dreamer and how can you lead collectively with purpose and vision. And what I'd like to emphasize with you is a story that takes me back a few years when I was doing some consulting work in a district. And I went in to visit with the high school principal. And the high school principal says to me, you know, I've listened to what you've said, and I really think it's terrific, but I don't have any time for that. And I said to him, well, why don't you have time? And he says to me, well, you know, people come in and out all day, and I have to solve this problem and solve that problem. And I said to him, well, that's the problem. And he says, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, see, you're putting all the monkeys on your back. Instead of kind of leading together with people, in empowering people to solve their own problems and to work with you. I said, if you kind of gave back the monkeys to them and asked them to take a leadership role, then perhaps you would have time to lead more effectively, and not just to be a manager, but to be a leader along the way. And so I think that once we lead, they know when to manage and they know when to get out of the way. I remember once doing a session with principals, and after lunch, one of the principals stood up and said, I know the problem. And I said, well, what was the problem? He says, I'm in the way. He says, I get in everybody's way. And so when we look at our role as vision setters, I think we have to look at ourselves as knowing that we not only lead, but we as principals follow, and we know when to get out of the way. And we call this collective leadership. And collective leadership is a process, and the process is valued more than the person. Yes, you are a leader because you hold a title called principal or assistant principal. And what that does is it creates in you a position of leadership. But imagine if you could take that position and turn it into a process of leadership. And it's a process where people are together, they are accomplishing a collective good together, and individual goals are kind of subsumed in the collective goals of the group. And so you will see on some of the slides, if you get these afterwards or if you take a look at them, you'll see this little icon in the corner that will allow you to click on these links and go to those sites. Because I think as a principal or assistant principal, the goal is to get others to become learners from you and to use that collective experience together for each other. And so leadership becomes more of a process than a person. What I'd like to do now is I would like to gather you into some Zoom rooms. And we're going to have about 4 people in a Zoom room, and we're going to give you about 5 minutes that will be timed. And I'd like you to briefly introduce yourself to each other in about 20 seconds each. And then I'd like you to talk about this question that I posed here. Referencing your strengths and your challenges as principal or assistant principal, whatever role you hold, how can you build a culture in your school that supports leadership more as a collective process rather than residing in a person who is designated as the leader by title? And I'd like you to spend 5 minutes, and then before you leave the room, you'll get a countdown toward the end of the room ask one person in your group when we come back together to post in the chat one big idea from your discussion together about how you can support leadership more as a collective process rather than residing in a person.
And we are all back.
Okay, thank you. I'd like you to take a moment now and in the chat box, at least one person from each group, if you could kind of make a comment from a big idea in terms of the discussion you just had on some of the ways in which you can promote more of a collective leadership in your school. Okay, teams. Yeah, I see. I have the chat box open, so it may be blocking part of your screen, but I want to see from Kathleen, teaming. Teaming is very important in terms of developing collective leadership. And a lot of times we think we have teams, but they're more like groups. And we're going to spend a few minutes very soon during the webinar to kind of look at teams and your role as a principal. Harnessing strengths and encouraging others to share their expertise. Giving efficacy to teachers is extremely important because we know from research that principals have a direct effect on teacher efficacy and teachers have a direct effect on student learning outcomes. And so, in fact, if you are affording teachers opportunities for professional growth and for them to take the lead in professional growth, that's going to have a direct effect on their efficacy. And as a result, teachers will feel much better about the teaching and learning process. And so that's, again, one of the reasons why Fullan says to us that the role of instructional leaders are the teacher's role. The principal's more of an education leader, the leading learner in the school, because the direct effect that principals have is on teachers, and the direct effect of teachers is on students, and indirectly, principals have an effect on student learning outcomes. And so I think giving everybody a voice to work toward consensus is very important as well. Consensus is very difficult. We're going to spend a few minutes on that when we talk about teams. We'll come back to that. And providing an opportunity for distributive leadership, allowing people to share and become leaders in our building. I think that the challenge is to create an environment in which teachers rise to a self-empowerment. If we have to empower others, we're still in charge. So creating a culture in which people become self-empowered and rise up and offer to lead the way is a much higher level than us empowering people, because then we're still taking that role of being in charge. Cannot see your chat box. I'm so glad you can't see my chat box. That's good. Okay, let's move on from here. And I would like to share with you this that you can use in your schools. And you can ask yourself and ask your staff, are you more on the left side or more on the right side? The left side is about people leading, person who has a designated position. Collective leadership is more of the attributes on the right side. And so you can ask people in your school, are we mostly doing things top down or throughout the organization? Do we have focus on independent decisions, or are we working interdependent decisions? And this will give you a measure of how collective you are in terms of what you're doing in your school. And then you can look at the areas of strength and continue to improve them, and look at the areas of challenge and work on them, so that your role as principals, the vision that you set, the visionary leadership you have, is more collective than residing in an individual person. Let's move on now to the second phase, that of architect. The architect is the builder, and as a builder, the role of the principal is to build highly effective teams by avoiding trust busting and implementing trust builders and trust boosters along the way. And so in this world today, we have to break out of the silos. We have to really work together. And particularly during this COVID process that we're in, we depend upon each other so much more. Everybody needs so much support. Principals need support from each other. Principals need support from teachers. Teachers need support from principals. And so I think it becomes extremely important that we take a look at teams. And when we look at teams, there are certain attributes that make the team more effective. Let's take a look at these for a minute and choose that are most challenging for you. Let's take a look at these. We're going to take a poll now, and I'm going to ask you to identify those that are most challenging for your school, and then we'll share the results. There are 6 items, and you can choose more than one.
Right now, we have a little over half in, and the leading one is number 5, with following closely number 2.
Okay, number 5, our teams are committed to a growth mindset. And number 2, the team members are diversified and interdependent. Yeah, it's we have in education the fixed mindset and the growth mindset, and looking at the opportunity for us as individuals, no matter how many years we've been teaching or been a principal, that we need to continue to grow. I just finished 3 years of work as a coach in a large district in Kentucky. And I worked with about half the principals over those 3 years. And they were from the new principals to the most experienced principals. It was voluntary. And those folks chose to have a coach. And we worked together over a period of 1, 2, or 3 years, depending upon when they came into the process. And it showed the teachers, one of the principals went back and said, you have coaches. We have math coaches, we have literacy coaches, but I too have a coach, and I'm trying to grow just as much as you. It made so much of a difference in that school for those teachers to see that the principal was also focusing in on a growth mindset. And I think the teachers have to see principals as striving to learn together, striving to lead the way. And I think that's very challenging to do. And I think also the members of a team have to be diversified. The more diversified team members are, probably the richer the outcome. If we all are on a team and everybody thinks alike, we have this group think that we get into. And I find that a lot of people who are in schools have more groups than teams. You see, a true team has no leader. People take time to lead at different points in the process. They have a common vision. They are mutually accountable to each other. And so as we take a look at this, there are certain things that are going to improve. And I think the primary one is the collective trust. Trust is a transactional attribute. The more I trust others, the more they will trust me. And in order to be a trusting individual, I have to have all of these attributes in myself. And if I take a look at this and I say, yeah, I'm pretty competent at what I do, but maybe I'm not passionate enough. So I have to get more excited about leading the way. Or maybe I am a collaborator, but I have to work more on the commitment that I have to the work in the school of the various teams. Whatever we choose, if we have all of these attributes, then this collective trust grows and we become the bearers of trust building teams and teams building trust. It's a very important aspect, and it is also something that will build the collective leadership in the school, because the bottom line of everything we do is trust. As principals, as leaders of schools, without trust, nothing is going to happen that's going to be as effective as with that trust. And once we break that trust, it is very hard to build it back. And so there are trust busters, there are trust builders, and there are trust boosters. Take a moment now and think about some of the things you can do that are trust busters. Take a moment in your chat box. What are some of the trust busters? How can you bust trust? Yeah, saying one thing and doing another. That's very important. Breaking the confidence in people. Let's take a look here at this list. Not doing what you promised to do. All of these things bust trust. And I think the one that stands out to me on the bottom of the list, I do not follow up on agreed actions that are expected of me. Kind of saying, let's do this and no follow-up. That busts the trust. And the other one I think is my actions do not reflect my beliefs. What I say and what I do reflects what I value. And so I have to be very congruent. For example, do you talk about my teachers or do you talk about our teachers? I think there's a big difference on the words we use are very critically important to us in terms of what we do. And so all of these things here are trust busters. You could use this list and give it out to your staff and say, in your professional learning communities, in your PLCs, or in your grade level committees, as you meet together, let's analyze what we are doing. How many of these things are we doing ourselves that are leading to trust busting? What about trust builders? Take a moment. What's going to build trust in your school? Listening, taking initiative. What else is going to build trust? Following through. Empathy, yeah, empathy. I always say that leaders sometimes are animated from the neck up. They're talking heads. They're intellectual. They're very competent, but do they have feeling? Do they feel for others? Do they have empathy? Are they understanding of people's difficulties and challenges, particularly during COVID crisis that we're in now? People are very nervous. They're very they're in remote learning environments that they're not used to, and so all of these things here are very important. Here's another list for you, and I think if you take a look at this, these will build trust in your organization. And I think the one I highlight is consensus. Consensus is very hard to get. It takes a long time to get consensus on issues. But I think it's very important because teams build consensus. Groups operate by majority. Let's take a vote. There are 5 of us. If 3 of us agree, then we're going to do it. That's a group. That's really not teaming. A team builds consensus. And although the choice of the team is not necessarily something that I may agree with 100%, if I can live with it, then I'm going to go along with the group. It's when somebody says, absolutely not, I really can't do that, then the team has to stop and pause and have to spend more time in terms of looking at how we can build that consensus between and among each other. Finally, we build, and from building, we get to boosting. And team boosters are activities, are things that we do that are going to really take the team and make it into a highly effective team. What are some of the things that you can do? And I think, Michael, you just wrote something there, working alongside of the staff instead of from above. I think that really is a trust booster that's going to really bring teams along a long way. Here's a list for you. And these are boosters. These are going to make teams highly effective teams, which is our goal. If you think of a continuum, you have groups. From groups, you go to team. From teams, you go to highly effective teams. And our goal is to get people to do this along the way. And one of the good things is to take these three lists and have somebody on the team step out of the team, the professional learning community, the grade level team, whatever teams you have. One person occasionally steps out of the team and begins to analyze the team and gives feedback to them so that they can grow. And some of the items on this list are going to do that. The one I highlighted is demonstrating my commitment to lifelong learning by attending professional learning opportunities with our teams. I remember spending a couple of years in a suburban district, and I was working with the leadership team. There were about 30 different principals, assistant principals, superintendent, assistant superintendent. And over the 3 years, we met regularly because we were developing a new performance appraisal instrument at the time for that school district. And it took us 3 years to go from the beginnings of that to the end. And one of the things I noted is that the superintendent was at every single meeting, learning with his staff. And I think that's so important that the principal take an active role in the professional learning. It's easy sometimes for us to stay in the office and do other things while people are in their professional learning groups, whether they be small groups or large groups or individual groups. But I think it's very important that we demonstrate our commitment to others. I think one of the metaphors I like to use is jazz ensemble. And I think the jazz ensemble is a perfect way of thinking about highly effective teams. In a jazz ensemble, people know when to lead, when to follow, and when to get out of the way. There is a score, there is a melody, everybody knows where they're going, but they improvise around it. They allow for individual differences. And if you think about a jazz ensemble, and Wynton Marsalis, Moving to Higher Ground, his book, kind of gives insights to that. It's a very good way of looking at and thinking about teams and using that metaphor to say, how can we apply the jazz ensemble to the work we do as a highly effective team and the work we do. So you may want to think about that as you go through. Let's move now. Time is rushing by here. Change mediator, your role as a change mediator. And as a change mediator, how do you peel back the illusion that most teachers are resisting change? It's my belief that 90% of people are not resisting. It appears that they're resisting the change, but they're really not. And I think before we go into a few ideas, what are some of your assumptions about change? Take a moment and write in the chat box something you believe about change, an assumption that you make that this is true about change in our schools. Let's see some assumptions here before we go into this section. It happens all the time. It creates anxiety. Yep. It can be scary and uncomfortable. Yes. You see, what you're saying is answering the question. The people are not resisting the change, but they have concerns about the change. And while change is anxiety producing, it is necessary for growth. And I would agree with that. Let's take a look here moments in thinking about change and our role as change mediator. The first myth is that change is an event. And I would rather think that change is a process. It's a process that takes time. And instead of focusing on the change, we have to focus on the need for the transition, the why, and focus on building trusting relationships. We too often will implement a new program. We focus on the program instead of focusing on answering first the question, why do we need this? What indicators, what data do we have that tells us we should be doing this? And then we focus on building trusting relationships during that process. And we don't focus on the destination. We focus on the journey, the how and the what of getting there. We manage change. Well, I would rather say we lead transitions. I don't like the word change. I would suggest that you give thought to dropping the word change from your vocabulary and talk about leading transitions, moving from what is to what can be. Transitions is a word that doesn't get people to think negatively, because once you say we're going to have a change, people are already thinking, here we go again. Now we've got to do something else. Instead, if we talk about the transition from what we do to where we want to go, 70% of changes fail. They are not lasting. Only 30% of changes actually endure the time, the test of time. It takes 3 to 5 years to implement a change in our schools. 3 to 5 years. So if principals are switched around every 2 or 3 years, nothing's going to happen. You have to be there 3 to 5 years, research tells us, for change to take hold, and 5 to 7 years for it to be institutionalized, so that it's going to live beyond your life in that school. And so that tells us that this change is not an event. It is a process that is built over time. And we focus on the destination, and we focus instead on the journey. Let's take a look at letting go of the old. You know, when kids go to each other's house for a pajama party, and they sleep over their friend's house or have a party at their friend's house and stay overnight, what do they bring with them? Yeah, they bring a teddy bear, they bring a blanket. So in the change process, in making transitions now, it's important to let people bring part of the old with them. And they feel comfortable doing that. So if you're implementing a new program in math, it's okay to do some of the things you did, but now we're going to transition and try some new things. But always bringing that security blanket along is pretty important. Then we go through the neutral zone. People are wandering in the desert. They're wandering around. We have the implementation phase. Fullen says that in the initial part of an implementation, after it takes off, it usually falls for a while. And it's kind of like wandering in the desert. And the best strategy is to have a transition team. Have people who are excited about the change meet with the principal and give input from the staff collectively back to the principal on what are people really thinking? What are some of the challenges that they have in terms of making this transition as they go forward? And then we celebrate and embrace the change with new beginnings. I think if you look at this, it is more of a process than a product. So if we begin with letting people take part of the old, we support them during the most difficult trial, the neutral zone, wandering around, trying to go from what is to what can be, and celebrating small successes. I think making transitions will become much more exciting for people. And we realize that resistance makes perfect sense to the person who's resisting. I think that sometimes we forget that because it doesn't make sense to us, it makes sense to them. And so I would suggest that during the neutral zone, you address the concerns. So people are not resisting, they have some concerns. Maybe they want to know more about the change. Maybe they want to know how it's going to affect them in their classroom. They don't know how to manage it. It's something new. Now we have another thing to do. I don't know how to manage it. Then we begin to get up to the top where we have super hubs and people who are working with us. Those people at the top of the pyramid kind of become the transition team with us. And those people at the bottom have concerns. They're not resisting the transition. They're not resisting the change, but they need more information. that we have to guide them along the way. And so the apparent resistance to change really isn't resistance along the way. This is the concerns-based adoption model that's used. And I think it comes from Hall and Horde, who have done a lot of work in it. And the best book I have ever seen on making transitions and understanding transitions is by Bridges and Bridges, Managing Transitions. It's not about schools. It's about any profession and how to manage those transitions within the context of the work you do. And I would highly recommend Bridges' book to people who have the time to kind of read it. Finally, we come to the last one, and I sense I'm rushing through some of this, and I realize that I do 2- and 3-day workshops on these topics, and I'm trying to boil down just a few big ideas for you. The last one is the innovator. The innovator is inspire others and what can be rather than what is. And as we think of this, we can't expect that people are just going to be creative because we tell them it's time to be creative now. We have to create an environment in which people like to be creative. In the interest of time, we're not going to go into our rooms. I was going to do a Zoom room, but I want you to just think for a minute, and if you feel comfortable writing down in the chat box, can you recall when you are most creative? Let's put it that question. When do you get your best creative ideas? Can you write some responses in the chat box? In the middle of the night, oh my God, you wake up. You wake up and say, I got this idea. Yeah, I will share with you, I get my best creative ideas when I'm riding my bike. In the middle of riding the bike or struggling up the hill or coasting down a hill, suddenly something clicks. And I get this idea about something I'm thinking about in terms of a creative approach to solving a challenge. Or taking a walk in the evening when I'm under pressure to get things done. I'm creative, give myself time to really think through an idea. Yeah. So first of all, we have to recognize that we have to create the environment in which people can become creative. I think if we take a look at this, it's not about you being creative. It's about creative leadership. And creative leadership isn't about the leaders becoming creative. We're not expecting you to be, everybody is creative. Let's put it that way. Some of us are more creative than others. And our role is to create an environment in which people can become creative. I know for many years, I kind of looked at myself as kind of, the logical, mathematical kind of thinker. And I had to work very hard on moving to the other end, on trying to be more creative, more insightful. And I worked very hard at it. And I try to create an environment, a risk-free environment in which people are allowed to make mistakes. And so the role of the principal is to create the environment in which people can become creative. And I think one of the ways of doing that is to accept ourselves of where we are, because we have to be ourselves because everybody else is taken. And there's no room there to be somebody else. We have to be authentic. That's very important. And we have to give ourselves permission to be creative. Don't be afraid of taking a chance, of busting out of the cage and trying something new. I think one of the ways to do that is to create a culture of collective leadership, highly effective teams, and trusting relationships. Now the culture is there in terms of getting people to work in an environment, in a culture that's going to be productive for creative people's thinking. So without these three things, we're not going to be highly successful at getting other people to take a chance. And then there's the strategies. I wanted to share with you two: negating assumptions and how and why questions in terms of creating an environment in which people can become creative. One of the strategies to use for creativity is negating assumptions. For example, we can say, what if we did not group students into grades by age? What would be possible to do? Another negated assumption is, what if we did not teach by isolated subjects instead of having periods and going from one subject to another? What if we began to say, let's not do that? What I'm suggesting here is that you negate assumptions. You take the things you've done for years and years, and you kind of say, well, what if we didn't do that? And give teachers an opportunity to say, well, if we didn't, teach by subjects, maybe we could integrate subjects and we can develop a curriculum around, for example, around concepts. Take the concept of change over time. How can we put into that big idea social studies, science, and literature? As a matter of fact, I did that with my wife when I was teaching at the university. I came in and we developed a conceptually designed curriculum for second grade for around change over time for a whole year. We took all of the curriculum and put it into that concept. We didn't change the curriculum. We just changed the way we approached the curriculum. So we had blended learning. And students would say, when are we going to do science? And they didn't even realize that they were integrating things along the way. And so I hope today, if we go to the slide with the books on it, I have on there 6 books that I think are really some of the best in the field on some of the topics. I'm sorry that my computer screen went blank. At least you can still hear me. Maybe we have a minute or two if somebody has a question, if they'd like. Can you read off a question to me or two? Do we have any questions, Danielle?
I did see one earlier. Patricia had asked, how do others successfully draw out ideas from staff to those reluctant to share ideas?
Yeah, I think, first of all, you want to be sure that you do some one-on-one to build trust there, or small groups. Sometimes people are reticent in a grade level or professional learning community to kind of speak out. Some people are more introverted than extroverted. And so if you have somebody who is reluctant, it is best to do some one-on-one with them and bring them along that way before, and maybe they would feel more comfortable in working in a group or contributing to the team. Any other questions? Well, I hope you take away one big idea from today. Whatever that idea is, you go to workshops, you go to sessions, you attend webinars. I always like to say, what's one actionable outcome that you're going to go away with? Maybe we end our session today, if you put the last slide up there with the title and my name on it. I think that if people will put in the chat box, what are you going away with? What's the one big idea that you've heard today that you want to do something about? And maybe Danielle or Gracie could read a few of them to me to give me some feedback on what I did today, my first webinar, despite the technical difficulties here.
I know for me, Michael, I always love your analogy of a jazz ensemble. You know, everybody's playing a different instrument, but when you put all of that together, all of their strings together, then you get this great sound and you get this great ensemble. So I always think about that as I'm working with the team here at NAESP, trying to give everybody, you know, a voice.
Yeah, that's one of the things we had up on building strengths of teams, was to have a very diversified team like the Jazz Ensemble, where everybody's playing a different instrument. Everybody knows where they're going. The melody is pretty much there, but they play around it. They know when to come in. They know when to get out of the way.
Right.
Yeah, it's a powerful metaphor to use.
Well, you gave us a lot of good things to think about today in regard to leadership. I always learn when I'm in your presence, and I really appreciate that opportunity. We had some really good discussion in the chat box, and just want to remind people, if you're an NAESP member, in our last Principal magazine that you should have received, Michael did a great article in our last edition of Principal magazine. So be sure and take a look at that. And I think that really complements a lot of the information that you shared today as well.
And I welcome comments. You have my email up there on the screen if anybody wants to send me an email to chat about something. Not that I'm out and about now. I'm pretty much home in this period of time. So I do have the time and would love to hear from some of you in terms of a question, an idea, some feedback off today personally, so that I can learn to have a growth mindset about webinars. Okay, I think we've finished. Thank you so much for listening in, and thanks for being with me. And thank you, Danielle and Gracie, for your time.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a great evening.